Welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 231, Dim Siarad Cymraeg. In episode 218, we talked a little bit about the Anglicanization of the education system, or the English enforcement of the language for the education system, and kind of how that developed into what were to be the Blue Book reforms, which were controversial even in their day, and some of the discussions that surrounded that. And as we talked a bit about it, we're going to go a bit more in depth in some of the aspects of the education system in the first half of the 19th century and kind of what it led into as we move into the latter half, which we will talk about in another episode later. And so I wanted to give some time to discuss how this movement of the Welsh language out of the mainstream of the education system began to hurt and maybe in some ways help to drive a sentiment around it and to drive home the desire to preserve the language amongst some while driving the language out of others, and kind of how those work together. Now, I will say before we begin that I relied a lot on a couple of different sources, and one of which had a lot of the quotes that I have in this particular section comes from a book which was written in 2024 called Welsh Not. It is a very good book. I would highly recommend it. You can purchase it or download it for free, which is a nice little bonus benefit for me, as the PDF was free. It is a good overview of the education system at the time and discusses some of the highs and especially the lows of that system and how it affected so many of the children that came out of it and why it worked the way it did. So as we discuss it, keep that in mind, that we're not just talking about one particular thing. We're talking about the entirety of the education system in the period when education was just forming, when the discussions and the idea of literacy was only in the early stages of being spread to the mass population. Keep in mind that before this, education was generally the preserve of the wealthy or the middle class, people that could afford the tutoring from independent educators who were taught themselves at university or in some other method that allowed them to teach these children. Most of the people they were teaching were literate, and it made a huge difference in how they were treated and what the aspects of requirements were around their education. Something that would be a little different when we're talking about people who are not necessarily literate, who are sending their children into school to learn a language that they themselves don't know and how that affects them. So that's part of what we need to keep in mind when we talk about these things, is that we're not talking on the same level as the old medieval version of education or even the early modern Europe version of education. This is very different. This is much more mass education in the way that we would think of now, but not necessarily to the same quality or same design. All of that in mind, let's dive in, shall we? In 1847, the British government commissioned a report to assess education in Wales, which led to the publication of the infamous Blue Book. These reports were deeply critical of the Welsh language and culture and branded them as obstacles to the progress and morality of the Welsh population. This concept of standardized English education was seen as a sign of progress and success rather than an obvious move of a language into what appeared to be undisguised imperialism. This was something that many of the upper classes or even the middle classes in Wales saw as a necessity in helping to educate and enforce norms onto a population that it was perceived could become a problem. As historian Gwyneth Tyson Roberts noted, that the Blue Books, quote, painted a damning picture of Welsh society, portraying the Welsh language as a barrier to education and social advancement. They epitomized the prejudice of the English-speaking establishment towards the Welsh people, end quote. And I would add that this is not the British or English upper classes as well. This is also the Welsh upper classes, who were predominantly English speakers themselves and had little use for the language and thought it beneath the population to use it. It was seen as backward, as poor. It was equated with the worst aspects. And let's be clear, this comes out of many centuries of being told that the Welsh language is not great. If you want to progress, the Welsh language is not where it's at. If you want to become successful, you use English. I mean, all of that reinforcement of cultural norms built up since Henry VIII have reinforced that mindset into the population that has seen success because of it. And much like everything else, when you see success doing something, you're more likely to teach the younger generation that this is the way you achieve success. And so in a period where it's easy to kind of judge them and say, wow, that was terrible. Look at what they're doing. They're destroying their own culture. It has to be cultivated with an understanding that for some, not all, let's be clear, it was not looked at as being a bad thing. It was looked at as being a way to help a lower class population that was struggling and that was having problems getting out of what they saw as being that it was separating them from the ability to achieve success, to achieve wealth, to get out of the problems that they were having, to climb social ladders. Although in Britain at the time, climbing ladders were pretty difficult. But yet to quote a term that's very American, the British dream, as it were, was all about that. I mean, the idea of gaining success and gaining capitalistic fervor and economic drive was something that the British government and society reinforced. I mean, we're not even talking English at this point. We're talking British. The concept of the Anglo-Saxon white person being driven to success was definitely a big part of the imperialistic motive. And certainly it was driving this mentality even then. You know, this whole Protestant work ethic is effectively what is driving this mentality that somehow if you're a Protestant and you're from Northern Europe, you're somehow more successful because of your work ethic that you derived from your religion, which is at best ridiculous. And yet a lot of people in this period 100% believed that that was true. And it drove a lot of their mentality on what they felt they were doing with others. Was it right? Was it necessary? Was it problematic? Yes, it was definitely problematic. Was it right? Was it necessary? Probably not. One could argue that definitely not. And yet that was the understanding of that time period. So if we understand from that point, it's easy to judge based on our modern understanding, but we do have to kind of keep this in some measure of this was a time period which had a very, very different understanding of how things worked, which we're going to go into now, and you're going to understand just how different they worked. Education, as the 19th century progressed, became important to people. Literacy became important to people. It wasn't just the realm of the wealthy and the middle class, but an opportunity for everyone to learn and to use that knowledge to better themselves. And it had slowly become accepted that literacy and numeracy, being able to read and count, were obvious steps that brought people out of the worst of circumstances. However, throughout this podcast, from the Norman conquest to the settling of the Welsh marches to the current time period, I've tried to show that the drive towards English-speaking Wales was not always one of official drives, but rather it was often to be seen within the context of a more gradual and much inward-driven narrative, one that people who were seeking advantage within the English language enclaves began to understand that the best way to create advantage for themselves was to continue to develop the English language within their people. This, of course, would mean driving out the aspects of their own language, which obviously that's an issue. I often reflect, for example, on my grandfather who moved to Canada from Northwest Wales. His decision to cast off speaking Welsh because, as my father would put it to me, I never heard this from my grandfather, I will clarify, but my father definitely said this to me, quote, "It was a dead language," end quote. One that he would have no use for in Canada, so why speak it except on the occasions when relatives would arrive from the old country, as they called it. That mentality is one that many other immigrants have to make with their own languages, especially when you live in areas where the use of that language or your language is almost non-existent. It is why when groups of people came together like the Welsh did in London, they would then form collectives to maintain their cultural links and their language. But they were few and far between once you left the nation. Welsh outside of Wales became a novelty to maintain rather than an expectation or something done because the mass of others who also spoke it lived in your community. There was no Quebec, to use an example, where millions maintained the French language in the face of pressures from the English majority elsewhere to conform and to change. Struggling against the tide of your much larger neighbor takes a great deal of effort and near universal desire to fight against the cultural and linguistic flow, intentional or not. Living in Canada, I can tell you about the influences of a much larger neighbor to the south. The constant flow of language and cultural influences have as much or more effect on our society than, say, political decisions, especially over the longer term. Pressure on Wales to conform had existed at least since Henry VIII, as more of the Welsh upper classes and middle classes sought their fortunes from places outside of Wales itself. In this, English was key, and they knew that. Rather than build universities in Wales, they instead sent their children to schools in England to train them to reach loftier connections and to create economic advantages within the English language. For the rest of the Welsh, urbanization under industrial expansion just sped up that desire within Wales to conform to the cultural connections with England. Your leadership at your industry speaks English. The head of your union might speak English. The entirety of your connections to other jobs may be in England. All of this would force you to consider and train your children in English. To quote historian Martin Jones, whose documentation I have leaned on quite a lot, quote, "These facts shaped and drove the educational context. The middle and landed classes wanted to see the English language spread to help further open Wales's economy and to avert the dangers of a workforce that spoke a different language to many of the employers and landlords. The workers themselves wanted to be able to speak English because they saw this as a route out of poverty and the grind of manual work. Teaching English was thus the primary goal of the 19th century working class education," end quote. In fact, amongst the Welsh language communities that did live in these cities and towns, it was viewed that learning Welsh was something you did at home or at Sunday school. English was for the day-to-day work world, and it was one that you absolutely needed. Combine that with a delusional concept held in some political circles that the Welsh language bred discontent, and you can see how officials began to equate English with peace, progress, and satisfaction. With this in mind, here we enter the strategy that was used for teaching children. And here is where the rubber really meets the road of separating the Welsh language from the day-to-day of most lives, with the development of the Welsh Not boards or sticks at schools across Wales. If you're unfamiliar, let me take you through the comments of school inspector Dan Isaac Davis, who described education in parts of Wales in the period from the 1850s to the 1860s. Quote, "I do not know whether any other witness had explained the very strange traditional arrangement in Wales, which are something of this kind. The idea is that if you shut Welsh out of the schoolroom and the playground, you are in a way likely to teach English better. There is a plan by which a boy, if heard speaking a word in Welsh, is given a piece of stick or board about a finger's length and is taken out on the master's desk with the letters WN on it, meaning Welsh note or Welsh not. This is handed to the child, and the meaning of that is that the child, if he has it in his possession at the close of school, is to be punished. This child is not now thinking of his lesson. He is very anxious to find somebody who speaks Welsh in order to hand the WN on to him so that he attends to right and left to somebody before or behind him who is likely to speak Welsh. And as soon as he hears a Welsh word, he hands it over, and that goes on. And at last, the final culprit is brought up and punished." End quote. These punishments were varied as they were generally cruel, from a cane to the hand, to your bottom, to being forced into a chimney for others to mock you, standing in a corner on one foot while holding the stick, and being smacked upside the head as a more blunt solution. Along with all of that, alternatives included learning Bible verses, writing lines on a board, or being kept from recess or playtime. These devices were used in early Welsh education, and it was noted in the 1847 Blue Book as a tool that was used when then a commissioner in Denbighshire mentioned, quote, "My attention was attracted to a piece of wood suspended on a string around a boy's neck, and on the wood were written the words Welsh stick. This, I was told, was a stigma for speaking Welsh, but in fact his only alternative was to speak Welsh or say nothing. He did not understand English, and there was and is no systematic exercise in his interpretation." End quote. The use of the stick was similar to one mentioned by Davies in a previous quote. Quote, "The Welsh stick, or Welsh as it is sometimes called, is given to a pupil who's overheard speaking Welsh. It may be transferred by him to any schoolfellow whom he hears committing a similar offense, and thus pass from one to another until the close of the week, when the pupil whose possession the Welsh is found is punished by flogging. Among other injuries effects, this custom has been found to lead children to visit stealthily the houses of their schoolfellows for the purpose of detecting those who speak Welsh to their parents, and transferring to them the punishment due to themselves." End quote. The use of and authorization of the Welsh knot reached a level of infamy and mythology which outstretches the reality, at least to a degree. Let me be clear. The use of a private institutions rather than publicly funded and government-mandated ones is used to explain some of this away. In other words, they would say, oh, well, this wasn't every school. This was just these private schools who weren't really run by the government. But often these schools were still funded by the government. They weren't necessarily mandated by the government, but they were funded by that. For others, it became a sign of oppression of Welsh culture and language, which caused the downfall of the use of Welsh in the 19th and 20th centuries. It is suggested that the origins of these Welsh language punishments stretch as far back as the late 18th century, so they were well known and well used for around about a century. How it was used and labeled changes depending on the schools, everything from a stick to a board to something of a small token or even a tied handkerchief, Welsh knot. It is important to understand that regardless of how it was displayed, it had the same basic purpose, to drive Welsh out of the classroom. However, even if it was mildly overstated, you certainly cannot wipe away the fact that the practice did exist and that it was used as a tool to enforce English-only education. Yet, we must acknowledge that often this was with the approval of parents and that these educators were part of a patchwork system that had little rules or organization. As Johns describes it aptly in his book, quote, "The Welsh knot may not have been universal, but it was not something overly employed by a handful of schools. From the sheer range of references to it, in both private schools and those run by the British and National Societies, to separate religious denominational schools, it does seem reasonable to conclude that Welsh knot was widely used in the first half of the century, even if it did vary in name, form, and practice. Moreover, even in schools where it was not used, English was still the dominant language, and children could still be hit for speaking Welsh, even if they did not have to wear the Welsh knot. As the Blue Books showed in great detail, English was the primary medium of education in Wales. But the Welsh knot was nothing particularly odd to education. Other schools had dunce caps for children who got things wrong. Persons who arrived last were forced to wear a marker around their neck when they were late, usually referred to as the LN or late knot. Each case, physical punishments would arrive with these issues. Local demand for English was high in Welsh towns and villages because all parts of society, from parents to local officials and religious figures, were promoting English. They saw this as a way to better jobs and more disciplined teaching. Make of that what you will, of course. The politicians themselves began to acknowledge a need for education, in part out of fear that the new industrial poor would be a hotbed for conflict, a fact seemingly proven by the unrest found in these communities. Robert Slaney, an MP of Shrewsbury, warned the Commons that if, quote, if they did not give the humbler classes of society the means of obtaining a good practical education, in a short time it would be found that these people were not to be ruled by any government, end quote. The schools in Wales in the early period of the 1800s were, as I described, a patchwork. In some cases, they would hardly meet the description of a place you could take kids to learn. As Carney O'Harry's described of his school in the 1840s in Llanelli, it had a room in which there was one low door, a small window without any apparatus to open or close it. The floor was dark and damp earth, and a low, rotten roof leaked in torrents on rainy days. In fact, it was nothing but an unhealthy and deadly hole, end quote. These more rural schools, with their unhealthy and uninviting accommodations, were balanced against the industrial schools that were often paid for from parents' wages by their employers. Often, these schools were better kept and had much more modern supplies, but kids started full-time work at 10 years old, which meant they weren't in them for a very long amount of time. Sending a child to school versus them contributing to their family through their work added to the collective issue of why you would send your kid to school to learn. And there was this disincentive for children, even as young as 6, to go to school when they could work full time and bring home money to the family. Never mind the fact that most schools charged a fee for children going to them, which acted as yet another deterrent for sending them. Often teachers were barely managed, and their methods of punishment could at times border on cruel. Few received what could be considered a livable wage, and because of it, parents' fees were generally not enough to cover their wages. One of the few qualifications for teaching was that you had to have a knowledge of English, which could be a pretty low bar, as you would expect amongst a community which doesn't speak English. Some teachers would even be considered illiterate and just happen to know more English than their neighbor, so they got the job for that reason alone. As you can imagine, if you and your neighbors do not speak English, someone appearing to even have a rudimentary amount of language skills would be seen as an obvious teacher. But realistically, it would be like me teaching French to a bunch of children in my local neighborhood. Much of the knowledge that I learned was about 40 years ago and long forgotten. I had heard, and from either classrooms or from Sesame Street, learn how to count, say, to 10 in French, or maybe even say a short introduction about yourself, but anything helpful? Not really. It was often observed that these school teachers would often rule with corporal punishment, being accused of being lazy and generally having older children leading the teaching as they themselves were either asleep or drunk. There were a general sense amongst the children who were raised by these teachers that they contributed little to their education. During this period, education was also filled with concepts and the idea that the use of corporal punishment was a necessity to deter children from misbehavior, often seen as a key to discipline and proper growth. Often, former students would remember vicious responses from teachers to children talking in class or making mistakes. So while we earlier singled out the punishment for speaking Welsh, these were not oddities, they were the norm for these schools. As noted again in the Blue Book, quote, "The conduct of the master, the teacher, was wantonly severe. He was in the habit of striking the children in the face with a large rod, boys and girls indiscriminately and without regard to merit or demerit. In this manner I saw him strike one little girl who had committed no kind of offense, a blow which deprived her of her sight during the remainder of my visit. Yet he did not appear to be a naturally ill-natured person, but was ignorant of any better system of discipline." End quote. That's an odd one to my brain, but, make no mistake, education during the mid-1850s was a Wild West show, filled with horror and torture that would get one put into prison for decades now. But at the time, it was viewed as a norm, or at least, at worst, one in need of correction rather than arrest. In the midst of this, we understand that the Welsh Not was a larger portion of an education system that was militantly vicious in training the next generation. They may have done this either out of malice or even out of an attempt to educate, but there seems to have been some level of acceptance on how it was done, even if this seems mind-boggling in our own day and age. For in that age, it was seen as a way of developing obedience to authority, something that had worried the establishment due to concerns again around the excesses of the French Revolution and the rise of the Chartist movement in the last few decades. The idea of respect for authority and rule of law were seen as teaching tools rather than unthinking violence that would be handed out through fists or slaps. It was likely that it was used less generally than remembered, as the memories of students would obviously make them into bigger issues than they may necessarily have been. Trauma has a way of sticking with us more in our educational life than, say, normal experience. I can tell you exactly what happened to me when I was called to talk to the vice principal when I was 6 years old, better than most of my daily school activities of the next 3 years. And that's the reason why we remember these things and they stick with us. And I can recite, how that teacher looked, what they were wearing, what they were doing while they talked to us, and why it scared the absolute crap out of me, to use a term. And it was something I'd never forgotten, basically the better part of 50 years later. That is something that you don't necessarily have happen to you when you're just sitting there reading a book, or you're doing your arithmetic tables, or all of these kind of things as you're doing regular schoolwork. Those don't stick with you, but stuff like that definitely does. And so with that, we're going to get in way more detail about the education system over the next probably couple of episodes. And we'll spend a little bit more time as we move from the 1850s into the latter half of the century in talking about how school went from this Wild West sort of education kind of a little bit into a much more formal and controlled and governed system that we're more familiar with today, and why that was driven and what brought this about and how it affected the education of Welsh as a language, as well as the Welsh population in general. But with that, I'd like to thank you for listening or watching today. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, and if you'd like to just send me feedback, you can always do so at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com, or you can reach out to me on Facebook at Welsh History Podcast, or you can reach out to me on Bluesky or X or even Instagram at Welsh History Pod. And of course, if you would like to, you can help out the podcast financially through patreon.com/Welsh History. Anything you can do to help this podcast get exposed to others, regardless of whether it's through financial or through social media, or just mentioning it to your family, is greatly appreciated and greatly thankful for it. So with all of that said and done, I hope you have a great day. We'll talk to you later. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.